me now for our Friday panel is broadcaster Craig Foster and New South Wales One Nation Leader Tania Mihailuk. Hello to you both. Happy Friday, as always.
Yes,
Good
happy
to be
Friday,
here.
yes.
Happy Friday. Now, look, let's start with Peter Dutton refusing to walk back his comparison of the response to the Port Arthur massacre to that pro-Palestine protest at the Sydney Opera House. Tania, I feel as though what he was trying to say was that there was strong leadership from Howard during the time of that particular crisis. He faced the backlash over gun control, but still went ahead because morally he felt like it was the right thing to do. But what do you think? Do you think Dutton's comments were appropriate in this instance?
I think there are elements of the media that have been very disingenuous in the way they've treated Dutton over this, and indeed the Labor Party. Listening to those Labor ministers decide that somehow it's the opposition leader's fault.
Always.
And that there's no fault, with the Prime Minister or anything that the federal Labor government's doing here. So I remember that period, and I do remember really well that John Howard actually took a bipartisan approach. He worked with Kim Beazley, the then Labor leader. He worked with Cheryl Kernot, the leader of the Democrats.
Yeah.
He actually flew both of them together down to Tasmania to grieve with the community down there in Tasmania. So he took a bipartisan approach, and he did take that leadership approach. Whether like him or not like him, he did. And I think the point that Peter Dutton has made, and what he was really making, the point was that where's that leadership now?
Correct.
October 9th, as I remember where I was when the Port Arthur massacre happened, and I'm sure anyone who was young enough or old enough to remember will remember where they were on that day. There are people in Sydney now and in Australia and internationally that will remember where they were because of October 7th and indeed because of October 9th, where we saw this pro-Palestinian rally go out of control in Sydney. It was an international embarrassment and indeed something that required real leadership to come forthwith from the federal Prime Minister and indeed from the New South Wales Premier. We didn't get that level of leadership. No. It needed a really strong. It needed leadership coming from government to say that we will not tolerate that level of anti-Semitism in Australia. That we will not tolerate it. We know it's been brewing under the surface for a number of years,
of course,
but it's certainly what happened at the steps of the Sydney Opera House is unacceptable. And I understand the point Peter Dutton is trying to make. He's essentially saying Australians want to see leadership now. We want to see our communities united. Anthony Albanese has the opportunity to work with Peter Dutton now and with all the parties, including One Nation and the many minor parties that exist in Parliament, to actually have a united front now and a united position on how to go forward with this.
Otherwise, even on the world scale, we look ridiculous.
Absolutely.
Craig, what did you think of Peter Dutton's comments this week?
I think that there's two issues here. One is the racism that we all abhor, and which we've been seeing on the rise actually for quite a few years now. We had a big rise during COVID as well, and then against many communities, and now, of course, anti-Semitism and also Islamophobia is also on the rise. And so we all need to respond to that really aggressively, but that shouldn't be conflated with, one of the worst moments in Australian history. The only thing I agree with Peter Dutton on this is that John Howard did an amazing job at that time, and that's absolutely for sure.
But that's the point he was making, Craig, in fairness.
Well, you can make that without conflating the two issues, right? And the only thing that I've liked out of it is that Bridget Arger came out, and we've talked about politicians within the same group who are prepared to come out and talk, based on their conscience, and they disagree. I think it's important on all sides, and we don't see enough of it. And Jeremy Rockcliffe from Tasmania, the Premier. The Liberal Premier, he's also come out and said, look, it's completely inappropriate, as actually has at least one of the person who survived it. So I think that, Peter Dutton should say, look, it was wrong conflating those two, but the point I'm making about John Howard's leadership I stand by, and he should, because that was a genuine moment in Australian history when we saw someone actually bringing people together, and that we need that more than ever now.
That's what Peter made. That's the point he made, Craig. He didn't make the point of saying that one issue was more serious than the other or comparing it. I don't think that's what was being made.
I think that's how people took it. That's certainly how I took it. And I thought it was really inappropriate.
Well, I think that what's happening is the Labor Party's jumped on this too because they like to play the
That's
man,
politics.
not the ball,
Yeah, I get that.
and there's a lot of politics involved in this.
Yeah.
Ultimately, the point was that we're seeking leadership right now, and we don't have that.
Yeah.
That's the point. I think.
Look, it's a real tough one, isn't it? Because I mean, it is separating different members of our society, which is the hardest part out of all of this. But let's move on, because more divisions have emerged within Labor over its migration laws. Now, with the Labor for Refugees group, they're now arguing that provisions enshrining mandatory prison terms and undermining protections actually breach the ALP national platform. Now, Tania, we know that a few weeks ago, Labor desperately tried to rush this through Parliament within 36 hours. They failed. It's now gone to a Senate committee. But it feels like Labor is now facing a real internal revolt over this.
Yeah, the Labor Party will always have this problem because the Labor for Refugees is a very big group within the union and Labor movement, and they've got a lot of say in that party, and they certainly have a lot of say in pre-selections as well. So their members are members of the party and the branches and the structure within the party. So it's interesting because they're going to... This is an issue that we need to deal with desperately. Okay, we've had a High Court decision last year. We know that we need to deal with this in Parliament. Legislation was brought that was totally a dishevelled response in reality. When you're seeing the Greens and One Nation and everybody come together and say, look, we've got to go to an inquiry, you know there's a problem.
That's true.
That doesn't mean there's a problem necessarily with every part of that legislation.
Right, so you would support that legislation?
Well, I think you do need that legislation. Right. And I think that what they do need to do, the Labor Party and the ministers and the government, is to actually sit down with the opposition, sit down with other parties in the Senate and try and sort out what can be supported through this Senate. Okay. Ultimately, it's at that stage. It's going to inquiry. It will come back for a vote in the Senate.
Sure. Which it will. I think, Craig, do you think that these concerns put forward by Labor for Refugees is fair?
Yeah, I didn't agree with the bill, so I like anyone who's standing up against them. I don't care whether they're from Labor or otherwise. And I do think the fact that it's had to be, this bill's had to be reverted to an inquiry shows a democracy actually working in this respect. But I also think, as we said a few weeks ago, that the High Court has rules to apply, and I always get worried in any respect, doesn't matter if it's around refugees or anything, where the government wants to take steps beyond that. And that's what's applied here. So I think the conversation is a really important one about all of our immigration at the moment. But, let's do it in this appropriate way, right? Let's have a sane conversation, which actually, happily, is now happening about this bill.
Yeah, well, that's it. I mean, it's very rare you get the Greens and the Party actually team up on something. So, exactly. This is a rare moment. Now, international students are set to be slugged with hugely more expensive non-refundable visa application fees as Labor tries to reduce migration levels. Australia already has the second most expensive visa application fees among the major student markets. Applicants pay $710 to apply for a student visa, compared with, say, the equivalent of $345 in New Zealand. Tania, what do you think about this? Do you think that this is a fair move? We're trying to bring down that rate of migration. Is this the way to do it?
Well, 700,000 students is just way too much. Think about the impact on infrastructure, on housing, on hospitals.
Well, we don't have the infrastructure.
We don't. So you can only think about the impact. But I also think that, look, it's a competitive market. It's a cash cow for universities. They love having international students. It started off with 10%. It grew to 30%. It's 40%. It's something like almost 50% now students. It's extraordinary having international students hold up universities. And it's really unfair for students. The people I'm thinking of are the students in Australia, domestic students who are paying huge HECS bills.
Yeah, so am I.
They're stuck in paying a HECS bill.
So am I.
Still going.
Yeah, well done.
Yeah, that's the issue. They're paying HECS.
That is the issue.
But what about, a slight increase in the fee for international students? Most of these international students can afford it, okay? Let's be very honest. They can afford it. They're not coming from poor families. They're actually coming from very wealthy families, so they can afford it.
Not always.
No, they are, because the international fees are huge, okay? What they end up paying. What they actually end up paying the university, not what they pay for the visa application.
But that doesn't mean they're wealthy families. That means they somehow find the money.
But it's not our worry. My worry is the domestic students are having a tough time.
So is mine. So I completely agree with you. I think the fact that we had a great article on a few weeks ago saying saying that actually the petroleum resources rent tax, for example, that international gas companies pay is half of what our kids are paying on HECS.
Yeah.
So if our starting position is that we want the most educated country in the world, that's the only way to future-proof our next generation.
We're making them broke, these kids.
That's exactly
why
right.
they can't get into
So I'm talking university and TAFE, I'm not talking only university. Then that has to be done. My question is, have we defunded universities and then put the load on them to then bring more international students in order to fund our university system? That's a big question for us, and therefore we have to look at that as part of, I think, an overall kind of review of the tax system. But ultimately, our university and our education for kids in Australia should be free.
Yeah.
You know, we are a resource-rich country, and it's not right that that's happening. So I agree that we should look at the
resources sector, Craig, in Australia. So I don't. We might be rich in resources. We're not tapping into it.
It'd be great if we had free education. That would be.
We should have it. Right?
I think that ship sailed.
To have an access to education.
Yeah.
Now, look, this one's interesting because the president of the North Melbourne AFL club, Dr. Sonia Hood, she's quit social media after copping abuse online for her playful, as it's been described, interaction with fans while the team struggles on the field. Hood regularly interacts with fans on X, despite the club being winless this year. Craig, look, you know as well as anyone that fans are very passionate about their clubs. You would know from your own soccer days.
Exactly.
CEO, she chats to fans, she keeps the morale up. Do you think it was appropriate that she does this?
Sure, it's appropriate she does it. I mean, you know, you reacting and responding and interacting with fans can be difficult, that's for sure, but there has to be a line in the way that they also respond.
Yes.
And we see too much on social media, particularly around women and high-profile women, these what she has called gendered misogynistic attacks, and they are, and they're easy to identify. Because it's like you should be somewhere, or you should be back in the kitchen, or, you know, get in your thing, or what, right? And so that's absolutely wrong. And so every time we talk about these, I keep going back to just the broadly social media companies. I think we've got a big problem with it. We've got a problem with the algorithms. We've got a problem with what our kids are digesting every day. We've got a problem with the next generation. I read something the other day about this next generation of kids just coming out of high school or just left, kind of the most lonely generation ever, and that they can't build relationships. And part of that is because they're obviously spending so much time on there. So we're starting now to get a real understanding of what the impact is, and I think Australia should take the lead in relation to social media companies and say, okay, we need to sit down and talk about what this means and what these algorithms do to all of us, and get control of it.
It's a broader problem, right?
And this is just part of it.
But I think you've got to look. It's freedom of speech, and I don't think you should be stopping people from making the comments that they're making. I think that's life. I think that's what this social media is all about, and it's about giving people an opportunity to have their say. Look, in the end, I think Dr. Sonia Hood, she's obviously unwell too. We've got to remember she was diagnosed last year with breast cancer.
That's a fair point.
That's probably, she's probably having a hard time in general with her health. I think you've just got to not take things personally. I get attacked all the time when I make comments.
Don't we all?
Great, you get attacked. You've got to not take things personally. You've just got to just switch off and go, okay. And don't forget, these people are coming from anywhere around the world when they're writing comments.
True. We don't know who they are.
You can't take it personally. Look, and people are very passionate about sport, okay?
Oh, very passionate about sport.
And
now, I'm keen to get your views on this, because this one sparked debate online. A photo of
this is great. Come on.
picnic tables at a popular beach in Sydney. Well, it's gone viral. Now, this was at Bronte Beach in the city's eastern suburbs. There's a tablecloth and a backpack on each table.
Can't happen. Don't do it.
Reserved it.
Get out. No way.
We know it's first in, but this is ridiculous.
Come on. This is un-Australian. Now, every Aussie, all of your viewers, we've all been abroad. So we've been to Fiji, or we've been to Bali, and the one people who hate when we see this, you know, you come down in the morning and you're around the pool, right? And all of the things are taken.
Ridiculous.
And everyone's sitting in having breakfast. And the Aussies always say, no, we're not having that, right? No, it can't happen. No, someone has to sit there. If you want to get it early like that, you have to suffer. I've done it. Like every Christmas day down at Bondi for 20 years. We're there at 6 a.m, right? And I have to sit there while everyone's sleeping. No,
I completely agree.
Don't
really quickly, I want to ask you on this one, Tania, because another case of cancel culture. Former Prime Minister John Howard has blasted the decision to rename the Department of Health's headquarters from the Sirius building after public servants complained about the Colonial Association. Here we go again.
Look, I can't stand this.
I know you're going to be really upset about this one.
It is, and I agree with John Howard, and I agree. Look, haven't they got anything better to think about? It's the Department of Health. I would have thought they'd have far more pressing issues than worrying about renaming their building.
Ridiculous.
The costs associated with renaming their building. And anyway, aren't half of them already still working at home anyway?
Well, that's it. They're all working from home most of the time. I mean, for goodness sake, here we go again. Tania Mihailuk, great Gloucester. Always a pleasure to
Don't put those towels down there. We're not having it.
See you guys next week. Thank you.